Hi, I'm Andrew Burtch. I'm the historian for the post-1945 period here at the Canadian War Museum. Canada's naval aviation dates to the First World War, near the end of the First World War, when there was a submarine offensive in Canadian waters and a decision was taken to start up a naval aviation tasking on the East Coast. That was authorized near the end of the First World War and then disbanded pretty much as soon as the war ended. And the Second World War, it was considered throughout the Second World War, but really envisioned in terms of carrier operations beginning in 1943. And the difference between the First and Second World War, although we did not get carriers until after the Second World War, the rationale for peacetime naval aviation establishment was really secured during the Second World War in the context of Pacific naval operations. Well, the origins of Canada's naval aviation in the Second World War were carrier-borne. The entire structure was based around building a capability to operate in a Pacific force, because after the war ended in Europe, there was the shifting of resources over to the West Coast and to the Pacific, and it was envisioned that two light carriers would go out as part of the British Pacific Fleet and contribute to victory in the Pacific, and of course that didn't take place. So there was carrier operations were at the heart of the rationale for establishing post-war naval aviation, and that's when first aircraft carriers returned to Canada in 1946. They did so with Canadian flyers aboard. So there was a blend of carrier-borne operations, so being able to extend the reach of your aircraft into a naval theater along with fleet operations, as well as a shore-based establishment for training and for shore-based patrols. There were Canadian flyers, naval flyers, during the Second World War, all of whom flew with the Naval Air Arm. And others may have joined with the United States Navy, but I'm not as up on that. But most of Canada's flyers in the Fleet Air Arm, there were about 260 or so Canadians who flew in the Fleet Air Arm or trained with the Fleet Air Arm. The most famous of whom was Robert Hampton Gray, who was Canada's last award-winning, last Canadian to be awarded the Victoria Cross as a result of his actions in Onagawa Bay in August 1945. During the Cold War period, Canada's Air Force was focused mainly on air operations in North America, air sovereignty operations, as well as in operating in Europe as part of the air division there, air superiority activities in Western Europe, whereas the Navy's responsibilities were looking more towards protecting the Atlantic Fleet and protecting other ships in the Atlantic Fleet and screening other forces through naval air power, and in conducting, now there were some kind of areas of overlap with like anti-submarine warfare patrols, shore-based anti-submarine warfare patrols, the Argus, that sort of thing, but the core of naval aviation was really directed towards operations of aircraft at sea to protect the naval fleets. Naval Air Branch came about as a result of wartime discussions about requirements, including carrier-borne operations, light carrier-borne operations in the Pacific. And so the requirements were set in 1943 or thereabouts. Carriers themselves weren't actually acquired until after the war, although Canadians did operate HMS Nabob and HMS Puncher with Fleet Air Arm pilots throughout the Second World War. And so this requirement for fleet light escorts was established during the Second World War and then carried over into the post-war period. And so it was, I believe, in December of 1945 that it was formalized as the Naval Air Branch and authorized as part of the post-war establishment. Canada kind of leapfrogged carriers. So although there was a hope that we would have two carriers operating simultaneously. That plan did not survive the transition into peacetime. And so after HMS Nabob and HMS Puncher were handed back to the Americans, there were Lend-Lease aircraft, so they couldn't, aircraft carriers, they couldn't be transitioned over to Canada. Canada took over HMCS Warrior and returned to Canada in March of 1946, so arriving off of Halifax, flying Seafires, I believe. Quite a display for the post-war Navy steaming back into home port. And then HMCS Warrior was paid off and replaced with HMCS Magnificent. HMCS Magnificent operated until 1957, I believe June 1957, at which point it was paid off, and then we had HMCS Bonaventure, which operated from 1957 right through to 1970, coinciding with the kind of end of the Naval Air Branch as a separate entity. Canada's naval carrier operations operate off from Canadian waters in the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean to provide fair weather flying down into the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, and the dispatch of a number of expeditionary forces. HMCS Magnificent actually saw our first peacekeeping troops sent to Suez and helped to transport those some of those troops and vehicles into Suez. And in Cyprus, the rapid response of the Canadians going to Cyprus was aided by transport of vehicles and men by HMCS Bonaventure in 1964 as part of that rapid response. So it did provide, although naval operations also helped to facilitate the deployment of expeditionary forces to peacekeeping operations. HMCS Shearwater was taken over by the RCN from the RCAF in December of 1948 and became the home of the Naval Air Branch all the way through its existence. So it was the location for training, for maintenance, for all operations. HMCS Shearwater is the home of the Naval Air Branch. The Banshee has been described as the crown jewel of naval aviation in Canada, largely because it was the last fighter aircraft operated by the Naval Air Branch. It was also, for its time, a very well-equipped fighter. So it was acquired, used from the Americans and refurbished. It was flown from HMCS Bonaventure, and it was capable of something that no other aircraft in the either Naval Air Branch or the Royal Canadian Air Forces were capable of, and that it was a guided missile fighter. It was actually armed with Sidewinder missiles, and so it had greater standoff and greater ability to engage with enemy forces. It also coincided with the launch of the Grey Ghosts. So this was the Royal Canadian Navy's response to the kind of Golden Hawks that was being flown across in air shows and these sorts of things. So it was really a chance for naval aviators to show what they could do with this aircraft. The Banshee did not see combat, to my knowledge. It was eventually phased out. So basically the airframes reached the end of their flying time, and there was no replacement for them. So paid off, I think, in the early 1960s, which coincided with the transition to a more general anti-submarine warfare role. So the kind of air superiority side was at sea not so important when the transition to more of an anti-submarine warfare role in naval aviation, coinciding with the development of the bear trap on Canadian destroyers and the purchase of the Sea King, and transition to kind of helicopter-borne operations, as well as the tracker aircraft providing anti-submarine warfare patrols. The branch's disbandment really came about as a result of unification. So the unification of the Canadian Armed Services in 1968. Also meant that the resources going into naval aviation were eventually transitioned into Air Command, and so the unification really spelled the end of an independent naval aviator branch.